Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Terumah, Perek Beis, Halacha Tezayin. The Rambam rules as follows: Chol ha'mafresh terumah gedayla or terumas meiser, mevarach kedem sheyafresh. Anyone who separates either the terumah gedayla, the terumah that you give to the kohen directly, or terumas meiser, the tenth of the meiser that a Levi gets, he has to give 10% of it to the kohen. Either case, you have to make a bracha. Mevarach kedem sheyafresh, before you separate. Kedero shemevarachin al kol hamitzvos. The way you make a bracha on all mitzvahs, as I explained in the laws of blessings. In other words, the Rambam is saying that Terumah is no different from any other mitzvah. Just like every other mitzvah, you make the bracha before doing the mitzvah. Similarly, separating Terumah, you have to make the bracha before separating the Terumah. And the question is asked, why is the Rambam telling us this? Isn't this obvious? Don't we already know this? That you have to make a bracha before every mitzvah. Why does the Rambam have to say? It's just like I explained, as if there's a chiddush over here. So a simple understanding of this is based on a better understanding of the Rambam's shita about the mitzvah of hafrashas and the sinas terumah. The Ramban in Sefer HaMitzvahs critiques the Rambam, who says that the mitzvah of hafrasha, separating terumah, and the sina, and giving it to the kohen, is really one mitzvah. So the Ramban asks, if it's one mitzvah, then you would not make the bracha before the hafrasha. Because just like by tefillin, you don't make the bracha when you make the tefillin, you don't make the bracha when you build the sukkah. Why? So the Gemara in Menachah says, because a mitzvah that is followed by another mitzvah, in other words, the mitzvah is not complete until you do the second part, you make the bracha on the second part. If you make tefillin or you build a sukkah, you didn't really fulfill the mitzvah. The requirement is not just to make a sukkah, you have to sit in the sukkah, you have to put on the tefillin. And therefore, the Ramban asks, if hafrasha and the sina is one mitzvah, that means the mitzvah isn't really fulfilled until you give it to the kohen. If that's the case, then right after the hafrasha, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah until you gave it. So the bracha should be done before the nesina, before the giving. That's the Ramban's question. Another question is asked, that what would happen if a person is mafresh terumah, he separated terumah, which once you separate the terumah, the rest of the produce is all tithe, and you could eat it. It doesn't have to, it's not forbidden as tevel. But what happens if something happens to the terumah? The terumah gets lost, gets burnt, and you couldn't give it to the kohen. According to the Rambam Shita, that's the end of the terumah. There's no mitzvah. Just separating terumah is meaningless unless you can give it to the kohen. There's no such halacha that if the terumah somehow that you separate, it gets burned, that the terumah is no longer valid, the hafrasha is no longer valid, and the rest of the produce is no longer permissible because it was there was never hafrasha's terumah. So the answer is, and based on some commentaries on Sefer HaMitzvahs, and it's elaborated on in the Sefer Nimukei Malbim for Rabbi Shapiro of Chabad Rosh Yeshiva in Torah Emes in Yerushalayim, in the very first siman. And he explains that it's a misunderstanding of the Rambam Shita. The Rambam Shita is not that there's one mitzvah, hafrasha, and the sina. That you separate the terumah is a half a mitzvah, and then when you give it to the kohen, you fulfill the whole mitzvah. No. The hafrasha itself is the nesina. When you separate the terumah, the second that you separate the terumah goes to the kohen. It doesn't go to the individual kohen, it goes to the shevet kohenim. It belongs to the kohenim. The only thing is that the balabayas has the tevas hana, has the benefit, the power that he can delegate which particular kohen would get what already belongs to the shevet kohenim. So as soon as you do the hafrasha, you already did the nesina as well. It's one mitzvah and it's one act. And therefore you make the bracha before the hafrasha. And therefore if you did the hafrasha and something happens to the terumah, the hafrasha is valid because you already fulfilled the mitzvah of nesina. It already belonged to the kohenim. The fact that it was burnt means that the individual kohen would not get his share that he was entitled to. And that's why the Rambam has to tell us, the chiddush over here, you might think that the hafrasha and the sina are two separate components, and you didn't fulfill the hafrasha until you have the nesina, in which case you would make the bracha before the nesina. No, you make the bracha before the hafrasha because the hafrasha itself is the nesina. And that answers the critique of the Ramban. And that explains why the Rambam has to be mechadash over here, because you might have thought otherwise. You might have thought that the mitzvah requires the bracha before the nesina, not before the hafrasha.